The American Heartland, a place synonymous with quiet living, vast wheat fields and tight-knit communities. But sometimes the darkest shadows fall across the sunniest landscapes. In the late 1980s, Kansas City wasn't just known for its BBQ. It became a breeding ground for a fear that clawed at the city's soul. A fear personified by a predator who walked among them, silent and unseen. This is the story of a man whose gruesome acts earned him the chilling moniker, the Kansas City Strangler. Forget the sensationalized headlines. This is a deeper dive into the psyche of a killer and the lives he brutally extinguished. The kind of evil that disguises itself in plain sight, living a mundane life while his nights were dedicated to terror. The initial crimes, often dismissed as isolated incidents of urban violence, were the first tremors of a devastating earthquake. His targets were deliberate, yet seemingly random. Women, primarily sex workers in the city's low-income districts. This initial profile, unfortunately, led to a tragic lack of urgency from law enforcement. Their lives were considered expendable by the system, allowing the killer, whose true identity was Lorenzo Gilyard, to operate with a sinister kind of freedom. Gilyard's method was simple, brutal, and terrifyingly consistent. He would lure his victims, take them to secluded spots, and then use ligatures, sometimes torn pieces of their own clothing, to silently choke the life out of them. The sheer intimacy of his attack suggests a killer who didn't just want to murder. He wanted to control the final terrifying moments of his victims. He left no forensic trail, no witnesses, only a series of cold, dead ends and a growing tally of broken families. As the body count crept upward, from 3 to 5 and then to 7, a terrifying realization began to dawn, not just on the police but on the streets. A serial killer was active. But perhaps the most horrifying aspect of this early phase was the muted reaction from the mainstream media. Why? Because the victims belonged to a marginalized demographic. This silence, this societal apathy, was the killer's greatest ally. It allowed the terror to fester in the shadows, creating a chilling atmosphere of distrust and paranoia in the very neighborhoods he stalked. Women would look over their shoulders, not just for a stranger, but for the neighbor they waved to every morning. Every late-night cab, every flickering streetlight became a potential threat. The invisible man was winning not just through murder, but through the erosion of public safety and the silencing of the marginalized. It was a crisis of both crime and conscience. The year is 1987. A young detective, haunted by the growing file, started noticing a pattern that others had dismissed. A small, almost insignificant detail, a specific type of knot used to secure the ligature. He believed this killer was not some phantom from the city's underbelly, but a disciplined, methodical operator who had perfected his craft. This breakthrough, however, was a double-edged sword. It confirmed the existence of one unified monster, but it also painted a picture of a killer who was seemingly unstoppable. The detective's efforts led to a public appeal, finally forcing the larger media to acknowledge the crisis. The headlines screamed, "The Strangler," but the fear whispered his name on every corner. The hunt had officially begun, but Gilyard had already built an insurmountable lead, a fortress of cold cases protected by the very shadows of Kansas City. What kind of person commits such atrocities only to return home and sleep soundly? The terrifying answer is often the most ordinary. Lorenzo Gilyard, the Kansas City Strangler, did not look like a monster. He maintained a life of profound normalcy. During the day, he was a seemingly unremarkable employee, often working in maintenance or as a taxi driver, professions that gave him access and anonymity across the city. He was described by acquaintances as quiet, polite, and sometimes even charming. This duality, this flawless facade of a functioning member of society, is what made him the ultimate predator. He was the ghost who existed in plain sight, blending into the background of Kansas City life, observing, planning, and waiting. While police were chasing phantoms, Gilyard was changing the oil in his car, eating dinner, and preparing for his next night of terror. His ability to compartmentalize his life was a testament to his cold, calculated nature. The police investigation, despite the efforts of a few dedicated individuals, was hampered by critical flaws and a pervasive lack of technology we take for granted today. DNA sequencing was in its infancy. Fingerprint analysis was slow and often inconclusive on degraded evidence. But beyond the technical limitations, there were crucial investigative failures. Gilyard, it was later revealed, had been a suspect in minor crimes, related to violence and assault even before the main murder spree began. These were missed opportunities, threads that were never pulled taut. If the authorities had connected these dots earlier, if they hadn't dismissed reports from vulnerable communities, perhaps the lives of women like Margaret Bell, Catherine White, or Georgia Johnson could have been saved. This isn't just a failure of forensics. It was a devastating failure of perception, a blindness to the evil lurking in their own backyard. Every serial killer leaves a signature, a psychological fingerprint that fulfills an emotional need beyond the killing itself. For Gilyard, that signature was the methodical control exercised during the strangulation. Stabbing or shooting is fast. Strangulation is slow, intimate, and grants the killer absolute dominion over the victim's final, desperate struggle. The victim's clothing and possessions were sometimes meticulously moved or altered, not for forensic purposes, but to satisfy Gilyard's need for post-mortem control and ritual. This pointed towards a killer who derived immense psychological satisfaction from power and sadism. He was not just erasing lives. He was asserting his dominance over them in the most personal and terrifying way possible. The lack of sexual assault, in some cases, further emphasized that his primary drive was not lust, but the profound, intoxicating sense of absolute control over life and death. The Strangler's actions were confined almost entirely to the night, turning the streets of Kansas City into his private hunting ground. Imagine the inner life of this man, the polite conversations during the day, the mechanical tasks, all masking a churning, violent core. He built a mental wall so impenetrable that even those closest to him suspected nothing. He was, in essence, an actor giving the performance of a lifetime, playing the part of the normal neighbor. This psychological split is the key to understanding his longevity. His crimes were the release valve for a deep-seated pathology, a compulsion that he could neither escape nor control. As the body count reached double digits, Gilyard had become fully confident, believing he was smarter than the police, untouchable. This dangerous overconfidence, however, is often the first chink in the armor of a seemingly perfect killer. Years passed. The Kansas City Strangler seemed to vanish, or perhaps he simply moved on, leaving a dozen unsolved murders scattered across the city's heartland. The case went cold, shelved under unidentified serial killer. The city breathed a tentative sigh of relief, but the families of the victims lived in a perpetual winter of uncertainty. This period of silence wasn't a sign of peace. It was the ultimate failure of justice. A monster had walked free, his confidence bolstered by the system's inability to catch him. The detective who had first noticed the pattern retired. The media moved on to the next crisis, and the Strangler's victims risked being forgotten, reduced to mere statistics in a dusty file cabinet. But the science of justice, unlike the men who administer it, never truly sleeps. The tide began to turn in the late 1990s and early 2000s, driven by a revolution in forensic science, DNA technology. Cold case units across the nation began reopening old files, hoping that the tiny, almost invisible evidence collected decades ago might now speak volumes. The Kansas City Strangler files were among the first to be pulled out, utilizing the minuscule biological samples preserved from the crime. Scenes, often skin cells or fluid, transferred to the ligatures. Forensic scientists began constructing a genetic profile. It was tedious, delicate work, but the results were undeniable. DNA collected from multiple victims, stretching back to 1986, all belonged to one single individual. The identity was still unknown, but the unidentified serial killer now had an undeniable biological ID card. The DNA profile, now meticulously uploaded to the combined DNA index system, CUDIS, became a silent, digital warrant for the killer's arrest. For years, the profile sat there, waiting for a match, and then in 2004, the impossible happened. A hit. Not from a new murder, but from an unrelated, minor offense that had required a mandatory DNA sample. The name that came back was ordinary, shocking in its banality. Lorenzo Gilyard. The man who had lived in the shadows for almost 2 decades, the polite neighbor, the seemingly harmless man who worked odd jobs across the city, was revealed to be the terrifying Kansas City Strangler. The detectives who received the notification must have felt a chilling mixture of vindication and profound horror, the realization of just how close this monster had been all along. The arrest was executed, swiftly and discreetly to prevent Gilyard from realizing the net had closed. When confronted, Gilyard maintained a disturbing, almost serene composure, denying everything. But the case wasn't built on confession. It was built on science. Investigators moved quickly to secure a fresh, indisputable DNA sample from Gilyard, which confirmed the CODIS match with 99.9% certainty. This genetic evidence, linking him directly to the physical contact made with numerous victims during the strangulations, was the unshakable truth. The quiet man from the neighborhood was finally trapped by the very evidence he thought he had successfully avoided. Justice, delayed by 2 decades and the limitations of 1980s policing, was finally ready to face the monster in the courtroom. After years of operating in the shadows, Lorenzo Gilyard finally faced the light of justice. The trial was a grueling emotional spectacle, bringing decades of suppressed pain back to the surface. For the families of the 12 victims, this was their chance to finally see the man who had stolen their loved ones and to hear the crushing scientific evidence. Gilyard sat emotionless throughout, maintaining the same mask of polite indifference he had worn for years. The prosecution's case was devastatingly simple. DNA connected him irrefutably to the crime scenes, a silent biological witness against his denials. The courtroom drama wasn't about if he did it, but understanding why. The sheer number of victims, the cold calculation, and the total lack of remorse painted the portrait of a true sociopath, whose ordinary life was a masterful deceit. What happens when the strangler is finally caught and questioned? The interviews conducted with Gilyard, after his arrest and conviction, provided a chilling glimpse into the mind of a serial killer, stripped of his power. Like many predators of this nature, Gilyard was highly manipulative and obsessed with control, even from behind bars. He would often refuse to confess, obfuscate details, and even subtly taunt investigators with his silence. His mannerisms were calm, detached, and utterly devoid of the rage you might expect. This lack of emotion is, perhaps, the most terrifying aspect. It confirms the clinical, predatory nature of his killings. He wasn't a man driven by momentary passion. He was a machine of malice for whom human life was merely an object to be extinguished. His polite, evasive answers only underscored the chilling realization. The mask never truly came off. In 2011, Lorenzo Gilyard was finally convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to life, imprisonment without parole, a decision that finally brought a measure of peace to Kansas City. But the legacy of the Strangler goes far beyond his incarceration. His crimes exposed fundamental flaws in the justice system, the failure to prioritize cases involving marginalized communities, the reliance on outdated investigative techniques, and the dangerous speed with which cold cases were forgotten. Gilyard's decade-long killing spree became a brutal lesson in forensic necessity, directly pushing for the systematic use of CODIS in cold cases across the country. Every time an old case is solved by a DNA match, a small part of that success is bought with the unimaginable terror Gilyard inflicted. The Strangler is locked away, but the shadow he cast over the heartland remains. This case is a stark reminder that true horror doesn't always wear a dramatic disguise. Sometimes it wears the face of the unassuming neighbor who holds a steady job and offers a polite nod. It is a cautionary tale about the silence that empowers evil and the need for relentless pursuit of justice, no matter how cold the trail may seem. The fear of the Kansas City Strangler may have faded, but the names of his victims, the women whose lives were brutally cut short, must be remembered. They are the true legacy of this darkness. Their memories and the relentless march of forensic science ensure that the thread of their cases, once snapped by violence, can now lead to the light of truth.